Namaskar. I am a cultural and intellectual historian of early India who specializes in working with Sanskrit literature. I am associate professor at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, India, and I'm also the author of The Making of Early Kashmir, Landscape and Identity in the Rajtarangini, and the editor and translator of a work called Looking Within, Life Lessons from Lal Ded, the Shaiva mystic from Kashmir. It's a great pleasure to be speaking here today. And like I said, I am a historian. So I would like to today place Kashmir Shaivism in a bit of its historical geographical context rather than a theological one. This is not only because we have Subhashji, Sunilji, and Vikramji to go into the philosophical content and the details of Kashmir Shaivism, but also because, apart from the details and the micro picture, there is perhaps a need to remind ourselves of the big picture, the wider context which perhaps produced Kashmir Shaivism, and in which context Kashmir was not alone. Let us begin, however, by noting that while Kashmir Shaivism, or even devotional Shiva Dvait, as some call it, originated no later than the 8th century CE, Shiva Shakti worship itself, that is, Shaiva-Shaktism in Kashmir, dates back much earlier. If we go just by material evidence, even then at least the 2nd century CE, as glimpsed in some incredibly detailed and beautiful iconography on gold coins from that period that clearly depict Shiva, Trishula or trident in hand, and tiger sprawled at his feet. And the coins also label him as Ishu, Ishan, Ishu. In addition, colossal Banalingas and Ekamukhalingas, as well as sculptures of Maheshwara as Bhuteshwara, which was the unique Kashmiri iconographic innovation in the representation of Shiva, and sculptures of members of Shiva's divine family, such as Parvati, Ganesha, and Kartikeya, are all also to be found in the valley from at least the 5th century CE onwards. And a little later, we are also getting images of Harihara, the conjoined Shiva and Vishnu representation, Trimurti, which would be Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh, but also sometimes the 3 Rupas of Shiva himself, multi-armed Durga Mahishasur Mardinis, including the splendid 18-armed Durga Mahishasur Mardini from Tengapura, who was recently returned to India from abroad where she had been smuggled, and assorted matrikas like Chamunda. We are getting splendid representations of all of these from the Shaiva-Shakt pantheon from at least the middle of the 1st millennium CE. In fact, the Nilmad Puran, composed in Sanskrit in the 8th century CE and the earliest extant account of Kashmir's origins and sacred geography, tells us that Kashmir was founded from a primordial lake where none other than Sati, that is the consort of Shiva or Shakti herself, resided. This was the Sati Saras, as the text tells us. Now, the Neelamad, as well as Kalhan's Rajtarangini, which is the earliest surviving history of Kashmir from the 12th century, unambiguously state that the valley of Kashmir is Parvati herself, and the king of Kashmir is but a portion of Shiva. So it says, Kashmiraha Parvati Raja Tatra Haransha Jaha Gyeyo, Hara Ansha, Haransha Jaha, a part of Shiva. I will return later, perhaps in comments, to this embeddedness of Shaiva-Shaktism in the very land of Kashmir and its implications for her selfhood and indeed her place consciousness. But for now, to continue the story, alongside this theistic and iconographic or saguna form of Shaiva-Shaktism, there developed a deeply monist or nirguna strand of philosophy in Kashmir that identifies Shiva as pure consciousness. This school that came to be called Pratyabhigya, recognition, or Trika, the triad of Shiva, Shakti, and Nara, or Krama, succession of stages of realization, was represented in the works of great scholar siddhas like Bhattanarayan in the 8th century, Utpaladev in the 9th century, Abhinav Gupta, the doyen synthesizer of aesthetics and metaphysics in the end 10th and early 11th century, and Shitikantha in the 13th century. Later, Laldyad or Laleshwari in the 14th century, whose famous vaks or sayings in the vernacular Kashmiri devoted to her great love for Paramashiva belong to this long line of realized souls, as did Rupa Bhavani in the 17th century and Sri Lakshmanju in the 20th century, who espoused the same continuous tradition well into our times. But what was this tradition? Though it is difficult to render this highly sophisticated thought in simple terms, we can say that according to Trika, all of creation is replete with one indivisible superconsciousness called Paramashiva, the supreme principle, as it were. And Shakti, primeval energy, if you like, is its principle of creation, Vimarshini. Spontaneously realizing this truth, this anuttara, this unsurpassed reality, is moksha, is liberation. But human beings do not realize this, since their intellect is clouded by delusions, maya, or amnesia induced by a sensory and material life. So this kind of life makes them mistakenly identify themselves with their worldly forms and roles, or samsara, causing them a great deal of suffering in the process and obscuring their real identity, which is one with God, who is formless, nameless, pure consciousness. So Kashmir Shaivism may sound sectarian, but it is ultimately pointing to a Paramashiva who is nameless, formless, pure consciousness. Trika recommended a simple and spontaneous, sarala sahaja, recognition or pratyabhigya of this ultimate reality by turning inwards into the self. Because Shiva himself is subtle and spontaneous and resides within us. Thus, the path of Trika was actually Nishpatha Patha, a pathless path, in which through God's grace alone and simply an intent concentration on the self via observing the inflow and outflow of one's breath, which is called the Ajapa Gayatri, the natural mantra. Just this led to the direct experience or anubhava of the ultimate consciousness, which is first envisioned as the union of Shiva and Shakti. Thus, moksha or liberation in Trika was simply self-realization, an expansion of the indivisible self to include the whole of creation by seeing beyond all dualities and differences, bheda. Hence, Trika as abheda, which is the ultimate advaita, the ultimate non-duality. And also pointing, by the way, to the incredible inclusivism of Kashmir Shaivism, which advocates rising above or being able to see beyond differences. So pure consciousness thus experienced, according to the early exponents of Trika, was a state of blissful and radiant freedom, which was nothingness. Shunya ati shunya. As Laleshwari put it, practices, tantra, gave way to knowledge, mantra. Knowledge dissolved into consciousness. When consciousness dissolved, nothing remained. Nothingness dissolved into nothingness. Now, Anyone familiar with the hugely influential, dare I say, defining Indic tradition of Vedanta, that is, with the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras from at least 1,000 years before Common Era, the first text to speak of consciousness, Chitta, or Brahmana, and liberation as unity of the self, Atman, with Brahmana. These are the first texts to speak about this. And later their bhashyas or their commentaries by Shankaracharya, that Advaitin par excellence in the 8th or 9th century. Or anyone familiar with the still later popular Nirguna Gnostic traditions associated with Kabir, for example, in Banaras. The Nathapanthis like Matsyendranath and Gorakhnath in the Ganga plains, again starting 8th or 9th century. Or the Veerashaiva Yakka Mahadevi in Karnataka. Or even, if I may extend this, Nanak in Punjab, who spoke of Ek Omkar, and Namadev in Maharashtra, who sees Vithala. So he doesn't name it as Shiva, but he speaks of Vithala as precisely this absolute, this supreme absolute. All of these traditions espouse this simple, spontaneous, non-ritualistic, deep devotion to a God, culminating in union with the supreme absolute who was Nirguna. So anyone who is actually conversant with or familiar with these traditions will have no difficulty perhaps in recognizing that Kashmir Shaivism, its doctrinal and expressive particularities apart. So let me underline that. Keeping aside the expressive particularities of Kashmir Shaivism, I think there can be no doubt that Trika was but a regional efflorescence or a regional offshoot of a pan-Indic monist consciousness. And this is the larger historical context within which I began today by urging that we understand the emergence of Kashmir Shaivism. For while there is no dearth of metaphysical studies on Trika, it may perhaps be fair to say that some of the scholarship has tended to treat of Kashmir Shaivism in a historical vacuum, making of it something of an esoteric, even exotic exhibit, or a self-contained cultural isolate in all its uniqueness. I dare say this emphasis on uniqueness converges with the manner in which the region of Kashmir herself has been misunderstood and misrepresented in historiography in the last 200 years as a secluded, insular, and thereby a unique cultural formation that somehow had no truck with the supra region, which is with the Indic mainland. Now, as I have shown in my book, The Making of Early Kashmir, it is simply unhistorical and untrue to speak of an isolated and unique Kashmir. Let me clarify. Kashmir is as unique as any and every region of this incredibly diverse country called India. But to suggest that her uniqueness stemmed from an isolation from the Indic mainstream in history is simply false. Because there is an overabundance of evidence, material and textual, empirical and discursive, to urge our moving away from what I call the unique history paradigm to the connected histories paradigm for Kashmir and the rest of India, if we are to truly understand the birth and emergence of Kashmir as a culture region, and indeed the birth of Kashmir Shaivism. There is no time for details today, they're all there in the book, but suffice it here to say that from at least the 5th century BCE onwards, that is from the dawn of civilization in the valley, till at least the 12th century CE, all cultural markers in Kashmir, what do I mean? Archaeology, textual representations, foreign accounts, inscriptions, coins, languages, art, religion, philosophy, all of them speak to a Kashmir that was open, plural, and cosmopolitan rather than isolated and insular. And a Kashmir that was overwhelmingly Indic in her genesis and composition. In fact, we see a constant synchrony with other regions of India, both near and far, and very deep and extensive, very real connections, and what are called mutual entanglements, to use a word from Connected Histories, between Kashmir and not just her neighboring areas like Punjab and Himachal, but with centers of Indic civilization in the deep interiors of India, like Patna in Bihar, Nalanda, Gaya, Banaras, Allahabad, Mathura, Malwa in central India, Gaud, Bengal in East India, Assam in northeast India, right down till Karnataka, Kuntala, which is Telangana, and Tamil Nadu in the far south. Here was cultural transmission and communication of astonishing reach and multilinear character. So it wasn't a one-way stream, it was actually at least multilinear, the very context in which we are to understand the birth of something like Kashmir Shaivism. Because Kashmiris looked to these other parts of India for a whole range of things, from politics. For example, do we know that Kashmir was a part of pan-Indic political formations right from the beginning, namely the Mauryan Empire, and it is Ashok Maurya from Magad, if you please, who is supposed to have founded the capital of Srinagar, of Kashmir, which is Srinagari. Not to mention the Indic kingdoms of the Kushanas and the Hunas later and so on. Not to mention the kings and queens and courtiers of Kashmir were also actually drawn from different parts of India. We only need to read the Raj Tarangani with some care to adduce all this massive evidence. So Kashmir looked to the rest of India for politics, trade, education, asylum, employment, art, religion, philosophy, aesthetics, fashion. You actually have Kannada haute couture in the court of Srinagar in 11th century under King of Harsha. Mind-boggling cosmopolitanism from that early in Kashmir's history. Also, pilgrimage is something that connected Kashmir with the rest of India, while people from different parts of the subcontinent turned to Kashmir for these very same reasons. And indeed, underlying this intense connectivity between Kashmir and the rest of India was the crucial historical process of migrations, both into and out of Kashmir over the centuries, with singular implications for Kashmir's demography and culture. But this has been completely ignored by the unique history paradigm. What am I talking about? Not only were kings, queens, and courtiers at Srinagar drawn variously over the centuries from Punjab, Assam, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Kangra, Mathura, Malwa, and Karnataka, bringing with them their own traditions and their own people, but a mixed bag of commoners as well. Students, poets, pilgrims, baniyas, to use a term from the Raj Tarangini, graziers, ritualists, and of course, Brahmins and bhikkhus are seen being settled. Where are they from? From Madhya Desha, that is the Gangetic Plains, Dravida Desha, southern India, Gaud, Bengal, Gandhara, Peshawar, Saurashtra, and Lat, which is Gujarat. Bhikkhus and Brahmins from here being seen settled in large numbers by several kings of Kashmir or flocking to it on their own throughout the centuries. And in corollary to this forgotten history of Kashmir, we also see Kashmiris moving out to other parts of India throughout history. This included again kings and ministers who turned towards Banaras and Prayag on abdication or on exile, and Kashmiri generals on the one hand, or scholars and literateurs. I'm thinking of people like Bilhana in the 11th century, or Mahapandit Shakya Shri Bhadra in the 13th century, who incidentally is described as Kache Panchin by the Tibetans, Kashmiri Pandit. So Bilhana and Shakya Shri Bhadra are examples of Kashmiris who took up employment either in courts as far south as the Deccan in Kalyan under the Western Chalukyas, or in universities as far east as Vikramashila and Udantapuri in Bihar. And then through the 12th and 15th centuries, we are also getting inscriptions from Srirangam, Chidambaram, that Shaiva center par excellence in Tamil Nadu, Tiruvarayur, again in Tamil Nadu, Kalahasti in Andhra, and among several other places, inscriptions that are fascinatingly speaking of original natives of Kashmir Desha, now resident as landed persons holding high official posts in the south. So here is historical attestation of Kashmir's openness and these intensive migrations and cross connections between Kashmir and the rest of India as far south as Tamil Nadu. And of course, we know it is popularly believed that Saraswat Brahmins migrated from Kashmir to other parts of India, especially the Konkan coast. So when you see all of this, is there any wonder really that Kashmiri culture for over 2000 years from its inception should have resonated with the Indic and vice versa? There's so many examples, I obviously can't go into them here, but let me just give you one episode from the Raj Tarangani, where we hear of Kashmiri pilgrims frequenting the holy site of Gaya in Bihar for obsequies in such large numbers that the Raj Tarangani tells us a Kashmiri minister in the 9th century actually sought tax exemption for Kashmiris from the local ruler of Gaya. Why am I singling out this episode? Because it, to my mind, perhaps aptly symbolizes early Kashmiri identity, which seemed to consist in a distinct regional self-awareness in the midst of an overarching subscription to all India beliefs and practices. And Kashmiris seem to wear their local and universal affiliations with pride and ease. There is no conflict between the two that is reflected in the sources. And it is at this historical intersection that I submit the origins of Kashmir Shaivism lie. This intense mix of the Indic universal and the local. I want to conclude by giving two outstanding historical examples of this positionality of Kashmir, specifically vis-a-vis Shaiva-Shaktism. Very quickly. One, the Sharada Peeth, which lent her name to Kashmir as Sharada Desha. The Sharada Peeth, or the Sharada temple dedicated to Shakti Saraswati, at present, of course, lying derelict in Pak-occupied Kashmir, was once thronged by devotees from as far as Bengal in the 8th century, as early as that, and is listed by Al-Biruni in the 11th century as among the top 3 shrines of the entire Al-Hind, of the entire Indian subcontinent. And till today, some daily Hindu prayers in Tamil Nadu intriguingly begin with the invocation, Sharda Devi Kashmir Purvasini Namastute. Salutations to the goddess Sharda of Kashmir. So pre-modern Indic connectivity and Shaiva-Shakt Kashmir's role in it are truly astonishing. And this is best captured perhaps by the second and last symbolic example that I want to give you, fittingly of the great 8th century seer, the seer intellectual, the Advaitin, Shankaracharya. His 3 philosophical Digvijayas, his tours of conquest across the length and breadth of this country. Now, each time setting out on these Digvijayas from his home in Kaladi in Kerala, that is in the far south of India, he consciously chose none other than Kashmir. Again, the Sharada Peeth, which he calls the Sarvagya Peetha, the seat of all omniscience, as the fitting culmination of his Advaitic travels. This is no coincidence. And the ancient Shaiva Shankaracharya temple at Srinagar that still stands till today is witness to this epic visit, or to the local memory of this epic visit, as much as to the astonishing centrality of Shaiva-Shakta Kashmir to the imagination of the rest of India, and vice versa. I will pause my comments here and return perhaps after the others have come in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shonaleeka ji. That was most illuminating. So, Shonaleeka ji, are you there? Because you wanted to come back to some of your earlier comments. So maybe we can go to that until Sunil fixes his technical issues.
Certainly.
So please, Yeah, please
Certainly,
continue.
certainly.
Yeah.
It's a pity that we couldn't continue. Maybe he'll come back and we can hear Sunilji again. But I can perhaps carry on from the point he started, which is he was talking of how Kashmir is referred to as Devi Angan. So I just want to take that further because I did hint earlier in my presentation about how Shaiva-Shaktism is actually intrinsic to the place consciousness of Kashmir. So it is not some construct from the outside or a top down phenomenon or something that arises only in the 8th century and continues till a certain time. It is, in a sense, this consciousness is goes beyond even the historical trajectory of Kashmir Shaivism. That is the impression I have from looking at the historical sources, which are not necessarily dealing with Kashmir Shaivism itself. The Nilmat, for example, is also a Vaishnava text. The Raj Tarangini is not a sectarian text at all. It's not a religious or theological text by far. And yet, this is the construction of Kashmir we are getting there. Let me give you some examples. So, Kashmir emerges in the early historical texts as almost literally the place to attain liberation because moksha suffuses its ecology, as it were. Why am I saying that? Let me give examples. Harmukha. Now, Haramukha literally means mouth of Shiva. It happens to be a mountain, a holy mountain, 45 kilometers north of Srinagar. But
Right.
it is also the point in the human body, the name of the point in the human body at which the Kundalini Shakti lies coiled in the Mooladhar chakra. And when awakened, can ascend to pure consciousness. So the analogy, as it were, the parallel between the Tantra, the Tantric vision of liberation, and the very land of Kashmir is hard to miss. And this continues to come through in the works of Lalleshwari, for example. Because while she is invoking the hydraulic origins of the valley, you know, the Satisar I talked about earlier and how it is drained on the behest of sage Kashyapa to give rise to Kashmir as a land. So see how she, Lalleshwari, describes Kashmir as a bridge to salvation, but invoking this hydraulic origin. She says, I saw once the waters that flowed from the mouth of Shiva, Harmukha, to the foot of Vishnu, Vishnupada, becoming a bridge across the illusory world, Sansara. What is she doing? Now, for those who don't know, Vishnupad or Kunsarnag is 65 kilometers north of Srinagar, and Harmukh, I told you, was 45 kilometers. So, this allegorical verse thus beautifully captures not just the north south extent of Kashmir, but the complete overlap between her physical and spiritual domains, as it were. So Parvati too, we know, is associated with Konsarnag, with the vicinity of Konsarnag at the Naubandhana peak, which Lal is invoking here, because she is supposed to have transformed herself into a great boat now to save life forms during the deluge. So you can see all kinds of narratives are coming together to tell you the same thing about the land and the waters of Kashmir themselves resonating with Shaktism. We also know from the Neel myth, and please let me know if Sunil is back, and I'll be happy to stop. We also know from the Neel myth that the many rivers of Kashmir were identified with different forms of Shakti. And chief among these is Vitasta, which is the modern Jhelum. And we have Sunil back. I'll just finish the point. These multiple rivers of Kashmir are described as Mokshadayini. So each one of them is Mokshadayini. And then by the fact that they empty into the Vitasta or they join the Vitasta, they're all deemed to constitute this joint network that purifies the entire land. So as I said in the beginning, it is the ecology to go to for moksha or liberation because everything makes it so. Let Sunil take it from here.